Hey YouTube, welcome to Mountain Truth. Today we're going to be going over the top 5 sayings that are old sayings that have their origins in the Bible. Without further ado, let's get started. Alright, number 1. This one comes from Matthew 16:3. I'm sure you've all heard it before. People have said it's a sign of the times. Red sky in the morning means foul weather all day. You know how to interpret the weather signs in the sky, but you don't know how to interpret the signs of the times. That's where the saying comes from. But he continues on to say, only an evil, adulterous generation would demand a miraculous sign, but the only sign I will give them is the sign of the prophet Jonah. And what he was referring to when he said that was how Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the beast, which is also another saying that comes from that. He would also have to spend 3 days in the belly of the earth. The similarities there. Some people think that Jonah died while he was in the whale and was resurrected when he came out. That's just conjecture and up for speculation, but that is number 1. Our number 2 on the list comes from Genesis 45:18. This quote in recent times was popularized by John Steinbeck in a book called Of Mice and Men, where 2 brothers, George and Lenny, lived together in a tumultuous relationship. To calm Lenny down when he would get upset in the book, George would paint a picture of the future. It was a picture that he'd obviously painted countless times before, in which he and Lenny have their own place on their own farm and live off the fat of the land. And that is the quote. Comes from Genesis 45:18. Then get your father and all of your families, and return here to me. I will give you the good of the land of Egypt, and you shall eat the fat of the land. And while the Lord meant this to be a good thing for us, George ends up killing his brother Lenny while telling him this picture one more time. Alright, and our number 3 on the list. The Urban Dictionary describes this as everything that you do has repercussions. It comes back to you one way or another. Also saying you can't escape the consequences of your actions. What you do comes back to you. Now, a lot of people know this as karma, the total effect of a person's actions and conduct during the successive phases of the person's existence, regarded as determining the person's destiny, especially in his next incarnation. Well, it just so happens that goes back a little bit further than the modern term karma. It actually comes from the Bible, Galatians 6 to be precise. It comes to a warning about God trying to train us up to not be deceived. And what he says is, as you sow, so shall you reap. Or you've made your bed, now you must lie in it. But the actual verse goes, be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. And he continues on to say, those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit. So number 3 on the list is, as you sow, so shall you reap. Galatians 6. And that brings us to number 4. We've all heard this before. Go the extra mile. A lot of people don't know this comes from God himself. Comes out of Matthew 5:41, and what God says there is, if a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it for 2. Now Matthew 5 is rich in old sayings that we all may have heard. Matthew 5:38 says, you've heard that the law says the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's where the saying an eye for an eye comes from. Immediately after that is Matthew 5:39, but I say do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. Where the saying turn the other cheek comes from. But what we're focusing on is go the extra mile. Merriam-Webster has to say, the definition of go the extra mile is to do more than one is required to do. An example would be, she's always willing to go the extra mile to help out a friend. And that goes without saying. Folks, if you happen to see someone tomorrow who needs a little bit of extra help, whether you know them or you don't, or you know anything about them, go ahead and just stop and give them a hand. Everybody needs a hand sometimes. Well, that brings me to number 5 and my all-time favorites. We're actually going into Daniel 5 for this one. Now, let me set the stage for you. Basically, King Belshazzar, who was Nebuchadnezzar's son, He was sitting there in Babylon, one of the greatest nations in the world at this time. And Nebuchadnezzar, whenever he would conquer a people, he would go and he would take their religious artifacts from their temples and bring them, put them in his museum back in Babylon. So Belshazzar, he had about 1,000 of his nobles there, and they were drunk and having a good old drunken party. And he made his fatal mistake when he told his guard to go over and get the temple artifacts from the museum across the street. Now keep in mind, they were being laid siege to this whole time. And what they did was they started to drink from them and then praise their idols. And that brings me to Daniel 5:5.
Suddenly they saw the fingers of a human hand writing on the plaster wall of the king's palace, near the lampstand. The king himself saw the hand as it wrote.
Now that's followed up by what is the greatest line probably in the entire Bible, other than the things that pertain to Jesus. But it's just funny. In the King James Version it says,
The king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against the other.
You gotta love the King James for that. But what he's really saying is that he crapped himself and his knees were knocking. So anyways, the king couldn't figure out what this had said. This hand had written on the wall. And that's where we get the saying, number 5, I can read the writing on the wall. Now there's a few other sayings that come from this. Now, nobody there could read what was written on the wall, but Belshazzar's mom, she told him about Daniel. He had kind of been in retirement at this point, but he used to interpret things for Nebuchadnezzar. So Belshazzar summoned up Daniel and offered him up to half of his kingdom if he could interpret what was written on the wall. In Daniel 5:17.
Daniel answered the king, Keep your gifts or give them to someone else, but I will tell you what the writing means.
And then he goes on to say how Nebuchadnezzar, he basically says, now he was a great king, unlike you, you little twerp. Now I'm paraphrasing, obviously. So I'm going to pick it up at Daniel 5:24, where he says,
So God has sent his hand to write this message. This is the message that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parson. This is what those words mean. Mene means numbered. God has numbered the days of your reign and has brought it to an end.
This is also where we get the saying, your number is up.
Tekel means weighed. You have been weighed on the balances and have not measured up.
Daniel 5:27. This is where we get the saying, you have been weighed and measured and been found wanting. If you read it in the King James, it says,
Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and thou art found wanting.
And true to God's word, Daniel 5:30.
That very night Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, was killed, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62.
Alright guys, thanks for hanging out with me and going over the top 5 old sayings that originated in the Bible. Stay tuned for more Christian lists, top 5s and top 10s coming your way. And thank you very much. If you liked what you heard, then hit the like button, and if you're looking forward to more content, hit the subscribe button, and I will be churning it out. Thanks again, guys.